Good evening, everyone. Everybody hear me okay? All right. Hi. Thanks so much for coming. My name is David Shayevitz. I'm a professor of Jewish history here at Northwestern and the director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies. It's really a pleasure to welcome you here tonight to the latest installment of our annual Renée and Lester Crown Speaker Series, titled A Literary Conversation with Nicole Krauss. Before I introduce our speaker and kick things off, allow me to just say a word or two about the Crown Family Center and to acknowledge some of the people who've made tonight's event possible. The Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies is an academic hub for undergraduate and graduate education, faculty and student research, and engaging and accessible public programming. Our students, affiliated faculty members, visiting professors, and postdoctoral fellows study, teach, and research Jewish history, Jewish philosophy and thought, Hebrew and Yiddish language and literature, Holocaust studies, and the history, politics, and culture of the State of Israel. Part of what makes the Crown Family Center unique among the university's many departments, programs, and centers is our dedication to communal engagement and to building bridges between the university and the wider public. Tonight's event is one of several upcoming programs that aims to strengthen exactly this connection. I hope that you all received a sheet when you came in with a list of some of our upcoming events. Please have a look at those. Let me just plug Deborah Lipstat's upcoming visit and some other great events later in the spring that we'd love to see you all at. The opposite side of that sheet contains some information about how you can stay in touch and learn more about our programming online, and also information about how you can help support our efforts with a donation of any size. Our success is largely dependent upon the support of Northwestern alums and local community members, which is instrumental in ensuring that we can continue offering educational programming for our students and for the wider Chicagoland community in the years to come. Tonight, it's especially appropriate to publicly acknowledge two particular supporters, namely Renée and Lester Crown, whose vision and generosity over the years has transformed Jewish studies at Northwestern from the small program first established in the 1980s to today a major academic center focused on Jewish and Israel studies with over a dozen affiliated faculty members, a robust group of visiting scholars and postdoctoral fellows, and an undergraduate major, 2 minors, an interdisciplinary graduate cluster, and dozens of annual courses that enroll hundreds of students. In 2012, when a group of friends of Renée and Lester decided to give a gift to Northwestern in honor of the Crown's generosity and commitment, they fittingly decided not to commission a statue or a fountain or some other physical monument, but instead to reinvest in Jewish scholarship. The result was the Crown Speaker Series, which brings an annual lecture to campus and has featured an array of eminent authors and intellectuals who've profoundly enriched Jewish culture on campus. And our speaker tonight is no exception. I'm thrilled to be able to introduce Nicole Krauss, who's the author of 4 celebrated novels and is one of the most distinguished Jewish American authors of our era. Following her studies at Stanford, Oxford, and the University of London, Nicole published in 2002 her debut novel, Man Walks into a Room, a critically acclaimed meditation on memory and personal identity, which was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Award. Her second novel, The History of Love, was published in 2005 and was the winner of numerous awards, and was followed in 2010 by Great House, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and the recipient of numerous other honors. And I apologize that I'm going to have to skate over some of the awards and commendations here in the interest of time, because we'd have to spend our whole hour and a half together just going through all of those honorifics. Just last year, her 4th novel, Forest Dark, appeared, and has been hailed by reviewers as, quote, a daring novel, a brilliant achievement, a richly layered masterpiece, creative, profound, insightful, deeply serious, effortlessly elegant, both human and humane. Again, this is just to highlight the proverbial tip of the critical iceberg. In various ways, all of these novels explore the contours of Jewish history and of Jewish identity, the interrelationship between memory, loss, and storytelling, and the power and limitations of language and of literature. Now, tonight will begin as a conversation between Nicole and my colleague Claire Soufrin, after which we'll open the floor to some of your questions. Professor Claire Soufrin is a scholar of modern Jewish thought and literature who teaches Jewish and religious studies here at Northwestern, and also serves as assistant director for Jewish studies at the Crown Family Center. Her recent work focuses on the relationship between religion and literature through an examination of novels written by American Jews that address theological issues, and so it's a perfect fit for tonight's setting. Finally, let me just note that in addition to her lecture here tonight, Nicole will be speaking tomorrow night at the University of Illinois under the auspices of their program in Jewish Culture and Society, where she will present the Greenfield Lynch Lecture. And I understand that Deborah Lynch is here with us tonight, so it's really a pleasure to welcome her, Professor Dara Goldman of the U of I, and other friends and colleagues from Urbana-Champaign. I'm hopeful that this joint visit represents just the first of many future partnerships to come. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nicole Krauss.
Okay, so my microphone should now be officially on. I've got a little green light, and hopefully everyone can hear me. Okay, so it's my pleasure to welcome you, Nicole, to Evanston. We ordered the weather just for you. We hope you won't take it with you when you leave, because we all really need it too, I think. I'd like to start by asking you to read a little bit from your book, and I know you're going to read two different sections. So
thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm going to read to you from this most recent novel, Farah Stark, is made up of two different stories that alternate back and forth. And they both sort of cover the same geographical ground. They move from New York to Israel, to Tel Aviv, to the Hilton Hotel, and then kind of explode out to the desert. But more than that, they kind of cross and recross the same spiritual territory. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from both of those voices because they're quite different. The first one is about a man named Jules Epstein. And all you really need to know about Epstein is that he is an absolutely monumental man. He has all his life known the answer to everything. He's never needed to be silent because he always knows. And somewhat late in his life, at the age, late in his late 60s, his parents have both died. And he leaves his wife of 30 years or more. And he goes to Israel with the intention of doing something in his parents' memory. And he disappears. So this is about Epstein. No one could have imagined it, and yet it came to seem like a fitting end. Death was too small for Epstein. In retrospect, not even a real possibility. In life, he had taken up the whole room. He wasn't large, only uncontainable. There was too much of him. He constantly overspilled himself. It all came pouring out, the passion, the anger, the enthusiasm, the contempt for people, and the love for all mankind. Argument was the medium in which he was raised, and he needed it to know he was alive. He fell out with 3/4 of everyone he had fallen in with. Those that remained could do no wrong and were loved by Epstein forever. To know him was either to be crushed by him or madly inflated. One hardly recognized oneself in his descriptions. He had a long line of protégés. Epstein breathed himself into them. They became larger and larger, as did everyone he chose to love. At last, they flew like a Macy's parade balloon. But then one day, they would snag themselves on Epstein's high moral branches and burst. From then on, their names were anathema. In his inflationary habits, Epstein was deeply American, but in his lack of respect for boundaries and his tribalism, he was not. He was something else, and this something else led to misunderstanding again and again. And yet, he had a way of drawing people in, bringing them over to his side under the expansive umbrella of his policies. He was lit brightly from within, and this light came spilling out of him in the careless fashion of one who hasn't any need to scrimp or save. To be with him was never dull. His spirit swelled and sank and swelled again. His temper flared. He was unforgiving, but he was never less than completely absorbing. He was endlessly curious, and when he became interested in something or someone, his investigations were exhaustive. He never doubted that everyone else would be as interested in these subjects as he was, but few could match his stamina. In the end, it was always his dinner companions who insisted on retiring first, and still Epstein would follow them out of the restaurant, finger stabbing the air, eager to drive home his point. He had always been at the top of everything. Where he lacked natural facilities, by sheer force of will, he drove himself beyond his limits. As a young man, he had not been a natural orator, for example. A lisp had gotten in the way. Nor was he innately athletic. But in time, he came to excel in these especially. The lisp was overcome. Only if one listened microscopically could a slur be detected where he'd performed the necessary operation. And many hours in the gym and the honing of a wily, cutthroat instinct turned him into a champion, lightweight wrestler. Where he encountered a wall, he threw himself against it over and over, picking himself up again until one day he went right through it. This enormous pressure and exertion were perceptible in everything he did, and yet what might have come off as striving in anyone else, in him seemed a form of grace. Even as a boy, his aspirations were gargantuan. How many people know what to do with money? His wife, Leanne, had been allergic to her family fortune. It stiffened her and made her quiet. But Epstein taught her what to do with it. He bought a Rubens, a Sargent, a Mortlake tapestry. He hung a small Matisse in his closet. Under a ballerina by Degas, he sat without pants. It wasn't a question of being crude or out of his element. No, Epstein was very polished. He was not refined. He had no wish to lose his impurities, but he had been brought to a high shine. In pleasure, he saw nothing to be ashamed of. His was large and true, and so he could make himself at home among even the most exquisite things. But at the end, there had been a kind of drift. Later on, when his children looked back and tried to make sense of what had happened, they could pinpoint the beginning of his transformation to the loss of his interest in pleasure. Something opened up between Epstein and his great appetite. It receded beyond the horizon a man carries within himself. Then he lived separately from his purchase of exquisite beauty. He lacked what it took to bring it all into harmony, or got tired of the ambition to do so. For a while, the paintings still hung on the walls, but he no longer had much to do with them. They carried on their own lives, dreaming in their frames. Something had changed in him. The strong weather of being Epstein no longer gusted outward. A great, unnatural stillness settled over everything, as happens before radical events of meteorology. Then the wind shifted and turned inward. It was then that Epstein began to give things away. So that is Jules Epstein, or your introduction to him. And the second character in Farah Stark is a writer. And she finds herself in a moment when sort of the old forms no longer fit her in her life. So the form of the novel, she's sort of stuck in her work, the form of wife, even to some degree of mother, and she's searching for some kind of freedom, in a way. And so she goes to Israel, believing she's going there to do research on her novel. And this section takes place when she's already arrived at the Hilton in Tel Aviv, which she checks into, which is a place where she spent a lot of time as a child. And she's going to explain to you a little bit of why. To begin with, I was conceived there. In the wake of the Yom Kippur War, 3 years after my parents were married in high winds on the Hilton's terrace, they were occupying a room on the hotel's 16th floor when the unique conditions that were the prerequisites for my existence suddenly aligned. With only the foggiest sense of the consequences, my mother and father instinctively acted on them. I was born in Beth Israel Hospital in New York City, but less than a year later, swimming upstream, my parents brought me back to the Tel Aviv Hilton, and from then on, almost every year, I've returned to that hotel perched on a hill between Hayarkon Street and the Mediterranean Sea. But if the place has a kind of mystical aura for me, it isn't only because life began for me there, or that later I spent so many vacations at the hotel. It's also the spine-tingling nature of something that once happened to me there, an experience that only increased my awareness of an opening, a small tear in the fabric of reality. It occurred in the hotel swimming pool when I was 7. I spent a lot of time in that pool, which was set in a large terrace overlooking the sea and fed by its salt water. The year before, our visit had overlapped with Itzhak Perlman's, and one morning after breakfast, we came out and found him parked by the deep end, throwing a ball to his children, who took turns leaping into the pool, trying to catch it. The sight of the great violinist in his glinting wheelchair, along with a murky awareness that the polio that had crippled him had something to do with swimming pools, terrified me. The next day, I refused to go down to the pool altogether, and the day after that, we left Israel and flew back to New York. The following year, I returned to the hotel with a feeling of unease, but Perlman didn't reappear. Furthermore, on the first day back, my brother and I discovered that the pool was full of money. Shekels everywhere, shimmering mutely on the floor of the pool, as if the drain were hooked up to Bank HaPa'olim. Whatever lingering fears I had about swimming were shunted aside by the steady flow of cash we could turn up. As in any well-run operation, we soon divided and specialized. My brother, 2 years older, became the diver, and I, with a smaller lung capacity and keener eyes, became the spotter. At my direction, he would plunge down and grope around at the blurry bottom. If I had been right, as I was about 65% of the time, he would burst excitedly to the surface, clutching the coin. One afternoon, after a string of false calls, I began to feel desperate. The day was wearing on, and our time in the pool was almost up. My brother was wading morosely along the wall of the shallow end. I couldn't help myself, and from the middle of the pool shouted, "There!" I was lying. I'd seen nothing, but I couldn't resist the chance to make my brother happy again. He came splashing toward me. "Right there," I yelled. He went below. I knew there was nothing at the bottom, and now treading water at the top, I waited miserably for my brother to find out too. The crushing guilt I felt in those few moments comes vividly back, even more than 30 years later. It was one thing to lie to my parents, but to blatantly betray my brother was something else again. As for what happened next, I have no explanation for it, or none beyond the possibility that the laws we cling to in order to assure ourselves that all is as it seems have occluded a more complex view of the universe, one that forgoes the comfort of squeezing the world to fit the limited reach of our comprehension. Otherwise, how else to explain that when my brother surfaced and uncurled his fingers, lying in his palm was an earring with 3 diamonds, and beneath them, hanging from a gold loop at the bottom, a ruby heart. In dripping bathing suits, we followed our mother through the frigid, air-conditioned hallways of the hotel to the H. Stearns in the lobby. She explained the situation to the balding jeweler, who looked at us dubiously as he pushed a tray lined with blue velvet across the glass countertop. My mother laid the earring down, and the jeweler fit the loop to his eye. He studied our treasure. When he lifted his head at last, his giant, magnified eyes swiveled over us. "Real," he pronounced. "The gold is 18 karat. Real." The word catches in the throat and won't go down. It never occurred to me then that the earring might be fake in the way my mother had suspected it was. And yet only I knew just how unreal it really was, how against the odds was my brother's discovery of it, how it had materialized in answer to a need. No young child naturally believes that reality is firm. To her, its springs are loose. It is open to her special pleading. But slowly she is taught to believe otherwise, and by then I was 7, old enough to have mostly come around to accepting that reality was fixed and utterly indifferent to my longings. Now, at the last minute, a foot was put in the way of a door closing.
Okay, thank you so much. I have many points at which I feel I could jump in, but I'm going to start just thinking about those 2 characters side by side. I'm so curious how you wrote a book with two narratives that, as you explained, overlap, but those two characters are so different. Their voices are different, their ways of being in the world are different. What was the process?
Yeah, I mean, they are third person and first person. To me, that's a greater difference than male and female or old and young. Whenever I start writing novels, it's always a kind of messy process full of intuition. And I'm just feeling around for something or someone that feels alive to me. And that seems like easy enough, but it's very, very hard to find what's alive on the page. And usually it happens, there's a moment that happens that I never can predict when it will come, when kind of the mortal breath is blown into a character. And I think for these two characters, they had both been with me for a while. I had been writing Epstein for a long while. I dropped him. He was many other things. His disappearance in the desert was the one thing that sort of stayed pegged. But who he was and what he was about came and went, and I didn't know at all that he would become a novel. And the story of this writer who's stuck was with me for a while, and I really, the character is obsessed with the idea of the possibility of setting a novel at the Hilton Hotel, right? So she's obsessed with the form of this. The novel, the Hilton, if you haven't ever seen it or been there from close or far, is here on the cover, and it's this sort of monumental rectangle. It was built in the brutalist architectural style. It really is kind of brutal. It's just this big grid, and it's you can't miss it, really. And she becomes obsessed with the idea of its structure or form, suggesting some form for her novel, but she's also fascinated by the way in which it allowed her these otherworldly experiences. And that was really taken from my own life. Like, I was sort of stuck in this idea of the Hilton as a novel. And so then I thought, well, maybe I'll just write about this character stuck on this idea of the Hilton as a novel. And so those two characters were living together for a while, and it was only after a lot of time had passed and I was writing other things that I suddenly saw the alignment between them. And I think that alignment has a lot to do with a kind of spiritual turning. Epstein, as you heard, turns away from the material. There's a sense where in this material world, he's always known how to navigate, and he's known what he wanted, and he's collected this incredible world of fine things. And yet, late in life, there's this question that rises up, which is like, well, what if I was wrong? What if I neglected something else, and that something else is the spiritual realm for him? And he goes, if not in search of that, it's what finds him in Israel. And I think the same with the character of Nicole, which is the name of the writer. There's this sense in which she doesn't fully accept the confines of reality as they are presented. She's a writer, after all, right? And she sort of questions those things that we accept as reality, to begin with the narratives that we tell about ourselves. And in a sense wants to stretch them or break them or see how far they will be stretched.
One of the questions I had for Nicole, the character, throughout the book was whether she was finding what she was looking for, whether the trip was a success in that sense, because she ends up on sort of a different journey, which we can come to in a moment. But do you think that she overcame her writer's block?
Well, I think this book was written, so I guess she did. But I think that I don't think that there's any really great journey, certainly any really great spiritual journey, where one finds what one's looking for, right? Almost by definition, a spiritual journey is when you find something you never even knew existed, or you are awed, or something transforms in you, and which suggests that it wasn't there before. So I don't know that she even knows what she's looking for when she decides to leave home and go to Israel and check into the Hilton, like in the middle of the night, like in a semi-conscious state.
Yeah.
So it's not like she really has a plan or something that she knows she wants to find. And in a sense, her journey takes hold of her. And I think it's her willingness to be passive for a while, to let it take her, which is what allows things to happen.
Would you say that that's hard for a writer to be passive? A writer's always creating, or we imagine that writers are always creating.
Writers are also always watching and always listening and always noticing, what's happening around them. So I think that there has to be both a passivity and obviously a huge ability to create as well, but when the time is right, what I mean? And I think there needs to be a willingness to let things happen, or to be curious about how things will happen, and to not be overly anxious or afraid of where things might take one. There have been many moments in my life that were a little sketchy, where I thought, yeah, but it can make a good story. If I go, I can make a good story.
I should keep moving.
Yeah.
So why Israel? Both of your characters are looking for something, or in search of a project, or they have issues they want to resolve, or that feel in need of resolution. Why is Israel the place for each of them that they feel pulled to?
Well, it's different for each of them. and it's different yet again for me as the writer of this book. So maybe I'll start by answering what draws each of them. For Epstein, that's the place where he was conceived and born. And I think in some ways, after his parents die, he becomes like an orphan, as we all do, right, when our parents are no longer in this world. And there's something that pulls him back to that place where everything began for him. And there's a sense of regret and longing, and he wants to do something in their memory. And so he goes there where, in a sense, for him, everything began. His parents were refugees who came there after the war. So that's why he goes. But I would say later, because of all the things that happened to him, we can also imagine that he's drawn there for other spiritual reasons. And Nicole goes there, of course, because she spent all this time in Tel Aviv Hilton, and the Tel Aviv Hilton is for her this almost portal to otherworldliness, right, where the sort of constructs of reality have this possibility of breaking down. But I think for me as a writer, these characters are both in a moment of real flux. They have to ask and answer the question, who am I and what am I going to be, really, most essentially. And I think that Israel is a place that is asking that question every day still. It's not very old. And the question of, for people who live there and have to vote tomorrow, and is who are we and who are we going to be? And I think you feel that vividly in the streets there. You can't walk down the street in Tel Aviv without feeling the strength and liveliness and engagement of life and the urgency that I think that question is the engine for. And so it felt right to me to kind of put them there, but also put them in a place where, yes, there's this question of who are we and who we're going to be, but also, thousands of years of history. So there's this weight of determination, and what should we be? What do we have a duty to be? What are we bound to? But also, what are we going to be? So they're caught in that, the push and pull of that conflict.
And I see it coming up for each of them in different ways. So for Epstein, he gets pulled into this conversation about being a descendant of David. And King David understood that the Messiah is going to come from his line. So all of a sudden, he doesn't know if he wants to be there or not, but he's part of this group of people who are, in some ways, trying to anticipate the Messiah, sort of like some kind of ultimate redemption. That's one conversation happening. And then for Nicole, in terms of Israel as a space, it doesn't seem to me resolved. Can one make art in Israel? There's a conversation, is there space in Israel for great writers? She says they're all trying to leave, all of her friends.
Well, I think there's a huge amount of space aesthetically, spiritually, intellectually. There's just not a lot of possibility financially because of the sort of draconian taxation laws there. Like writers are still taxed 50%, which is crazy when you make almost no money for your work. As you know, for anyone, artist or not, the cost of living is just enormous there. To just have an apartment is a crazy expense. You know, most people can only afford it if their parents can help them. So it's just so hard to live there, let alone live as an artist there. But it's not a question of whether one can make art. I mean, it's a profoundly right place for you know, art making. Just there's everything you would want as a writer or artist there, in a sense.
So one of the things that both characters are interested in, each in their own vocabulary, is sort of nonlinear time. So it's interesting that you said they're both drawn to Israel as the place where they were born. Mm-hmm. And also I think with Epstein, you know, wanting to mark the end of his parents' life, that life in that model is very linear. It starts, you get married, you have children, you die at the end. But he's pulled toward this idea of Gilgul, of sort of the cycle of souls returning, and Nicole is really interested in the multiverse, and in the idea that there are multiple realities happening simultaneously. Is there something about Israel that makes those?
Well, I think she's, the multiverse comes up once, but I think for her, it's really about this conviction that goes back to her earliest memory, which is of being in two places at once. So this like divided imagination where you can be here, but you feel impossibly like you're also there, wherever there is. So in that early memory, it's like she sees herself in this television show, in the studio audience as kids, and she sees herself there. She's like 2, and she's like, "But it's me," you know, and she can't understand that. And I think a sensibility grows on top of that. And so here and there could be here and, you know, the old world of, you know, our grandparents that ceased to exist, you know, during the Holocaust, or it could be here in America and there Israel, or it could be here who we are and who we want to be, you know. And so, but she feels very vividly that divide of the one life we have and the life we could have or are having elsewhere. So the multiverse is a way kind of scientifically to confirm that possibility, but in a sense it's much more like visceral for her, the feeling. And I think, you know, for Epstein, I mean, he's really kind of juggling these, he's taken in without wanting to be taken in, just like, you know, he's resisting being taken in, but by this rabbi from Sfat who, you know, also just wants money. But there were some interesting ideas there. And also Epstein can't help but be drawn into the sort of beauty of this place and the landscape and the desert. And but I think the sense of time folding on itself is something you feel in Israel, you know, all the time. Like, right, you're walking in Jerusalem, but under the street is like that, and under that is that, and under that is that. So this is constantly this sense of the layers of life, or even modern life and not so modern life living together. And
So what do you find in New York?
What do I find
as a writer
to write about?
Just what is it that you see there that keeps you grounded as a writer? You've done such a great job of kind of capturing the experience of being in Israel, I think.
Right. I don't know. I have to raise my kids in New York, otherwise I'm not sure that I'd be in New York. But it's not that. I feel like everyone has written about New York, you know, and I feel like I will always set things there because it's a place I know like the back of my hand, you know, having grown up there. But I'm not sure. I think there are other places that draw me more in a way. And I think, you know, it's interesting. You know, New York is one corner of this much larger entity, and I feel New York I know and can report on, but it's always strange to be thought of as any kind of writer, Jewish, American, whatever. But American is particularly strange for me because I feel like America is so massive Like, it's so huge, and how can your subject be America? Your subject can be this tiny corner of it, And so I feel like if I have a corner of it, that would probably be New York. But even then, my pen keeps going elsewhere.
Yeah. And even New York changes constantly and from generation to generation.
Yeah.
You touched on two things that I wanted to follow up on, and I'll just go in the order that you brought them up. And the first was you mentioned having kids. And so you've written both before having kids and after having kids. And so I'm curious how that changed the experience or what you were interested in writing about, if at all.
I think the experience of being a parent is just so radical. It changes you in such fundamental ways. And so I think that for sure is reflected in the work. When I wrote The History of Love, I didn't have kids, and when I wrote Great House, I had two. When I finished it, by the time I finished it, I had two children, and I think that book is really came out of this feeling of like, wow, what is being passed down from me to these children that I might not necessarily want to be passed down. We think so much of what we want to pass down, but there are all these things that also go through our blood and our psychology that we don't necessarily mean to pass, thousands of years of history, of psychological history or trauma. And I thought a lot about what they were inheriting, and I think Great House came out of that question in many, many ways. So I don't think I would have written the same book had I not had them, and certainly the same with Farah Stark. So I think it just, whatever happens to us as people happens to us as writers as well.
Yeah, I actually was looking back through History of Love, preparing for tonight, and Bird and Alma, whose father has died, and their mother she's very distracted, and I don't think I had read it since before I had kids, and I had this moment of reading it differently and seeing a very absent mother through a mother's eyes rather than before seeing it through more of a child's eyes. How amazing they can just leave and wander, and they have these real private lives, and but then the mother looks very different when you think about what the children need.
I remember that shift happened to me as a reader. Like, I remember the first book that I read after my oldest son was born happened to be by chance about a mother and her son and other things too, but there was a mother and son in it. And something happened to me that I didn't really register until halfway through the book or something, where I realized that for the first time I was identifying with or like perceiving myself through the scrim of the character of the mother. And that entire time, up until the end of my life, I had always seen things from the perspective of the child or the younger one. And that is an extraordinary shift that happens to us. Just, I'm saying, what happens to us in life happens to us as readers, as writers.
Yeah, we bring a different self to the book. The next thing that you mentioned along the way, you talked about being called a Jewish writer, and I have a lot to say about that, but also to ask, that's one thing. Jewish writers are throughout your novels. They show up, they're always making cameos, and sometimes they're longer than cameos. So in Farah Stark, Kafka's a major character in and of himself. Yeah. At the opposite end of the extreme, well, whatever, what I'm trying to say. At the opposite end, there's a casual reference to Bruno Schulz, for example. So I'm curious, I have a sense that it's a little bit about trying to figure out what canon you want to be a part of, or where, who are the right people to read alongside your books. But I don't know if I'm right. So please tell me.
Well, I think that it started in The History of Love with wanting to just give a place to a lot of things that I cared about, things and art. And so various writers had cameos there, like Kafka had a little cameo in The History of Love, and as did Schulz, and many others. There were lines from Yehuda HaMachai that were tucked in there, and I think it was just a book of kind of gratitude to them in some way. But then I think by the time I was writing Farah Stark, Kafka, played a significant role in this book, and it was not for that reason. It wasn't sort of to find myself positionally vis-a-vis Jewish writing, but it was just too juicy of a story to let go of. And the story, if you haven't read the book, a true story about Kafka, on which part of Farah Stark is predicated, is that there was a court case in Israel that went on for 8 years while I was writing this book, actually. It wasn't decided in the Israeli Supreme Court until after I finished the book, about what to do with the remains of Kafka's archives, which hadn't been seen and weren't published, because they were in a ground floor apartment on Spinoza Street in Tel Aviv, where they were moldering with like 30 stray cats, and were in the possession of one of the daughters of the secretary of Max Brod, who is Kafka's best friend, who took all of the papers, all of Kafka's unpublished work from Prague and left with it all in a suitcase as the Nazis were entering Prague, and then came to Tel Aviv and started publishing it all, which is why we know anything about Kafka at all. And what he hadn't published by the time he died was passed on to the secretary, then the daughters, and this one daughter who was in her 80s when this court case was going on. She didn't want to give up any of these archives. And I just used to pass by that house on Spinoza Street and like inhale the stench of stray cat pee and just like fantasize about what was in there. And it was so fascinating because there was just like this double mesh, there was like the bars of ground floor apartment window and then like mesh over the bar. And it was just like, it was so much this sense of like what was imprisoned. Was something imprisoned in there? Were we imprisoned on the outside from touching what we all wanted, which is more Kafka? Was Kafka himself somehow imprisoned in there? And it just began to be this fantasy of what was in there. And then it really took off into a whole fantasy, which is played out in this book, that Kafka never really died in Prague at the young age of 40, but in fact secretly made it to Palestine, where he lived out his life writing in Hebrew and living in the desert, which many people asked me whether that was true or not.
If we were going to believe it about anybody, it seems appropriate enough that it would be Kafka.
Yeah, but I did find so many great paragraphs of like evidence in his letters and diaries that just like so supported this fantastic fictional theory that it almost could fly. Yeah.
I love it. Sometimes it feels like you can't be Jewish today if you don't have an opinion about Kafka, and it should be a positive opinion. You should love Kafka, or Kafka should speak to you in some way. I'll just share a quick story. When I was learning German, I was at a German immersion program at Middlebury College, and you had to sign away your right to speak English, which we were complete beginners. And as soon as we could read something, they gave us Kafka. Because, when you're studying French in high school, they give you existentialist literature like Camus. When you're studying German, they give you Kafka. And I remember I was a graduate student, and we read Before the Law, which you talk about in the novel. And I remember sitting there and trying to explain to this classroom that actually this was a Jewish story, and they just didn't understand. But I had like half a year of first-year German, so I didn't have the words that I needed, and my fellow students didn't have the words they needed to understand, and I felt like I was in the Kafka version of the German class trying to explain Kafka to my fellow students. And your book evoked for me some of that feeling of, well, any old person walking down the street in Jerusalem could be Kafka, or could be, somebody else secreted away.
There's there's a line in the book which is a quote of this woman, Eva Hoffa, who was in possession of all these papers, and someone had asked her something about like what would Kafka had wanted, and she snapped back and said Kafka wouldn't have lasted a minute in this country, which is probably true.
I can think of some kibbutzim he would have been kicked off of after 1 day worth of work duty.
Although he had this fantasy that he wrote about a kibbutz, what life would be like if everybody owned almost nothing, and what the work day was like, and how much time you'd have off. I mean, he really imagined himself into that.
Into living there, not just into seeing it.
Yeah.
And somehow we want to read the penal colony instead. I'll just ask one more question, and then we can open it up for some questions from the audience. So I want to go back to something you said at the very beginning, sort of distinguishing between spiritual and religious, and sort of specifying that your characters are on spiritual quests, that it's not about religion per se. So I'm curious just to hear you sort of reflect about the two words and the baggage they bring, that they bring with them, and then if I can have a little follow-up. Are you a spiritual writer? Is that an accurate description if these are your most recent characters and this is what drives them?
Yeah. I think I am. I hope I am. I mean, and I think of religion as something which is codified and has regulation and law and therefore allows for orthodoxy. And I think of spirituality as a kind of position toward the world and the universe. And I don't think you can grow up reading poetry or really immersing yourself in literature and art and not be spiritual, really. I think, anybody who reads poetry and then goes for a walk in nature and has that spine-tingling sensation when remembering some lines of poetry, that's a truly spiritual moment. And I think of it as just an opening toward the unknown or wonder or something of the ineffable that we just capture for a minute or sense the tip of, and we know that there's something much larger out there. And I think it's just that question of opening oneself toward that and not feeling comfortable with that uncertainty. I guess what Keats would call negative capability, right? And I do think of artists and poets and writers as being firmly in that tradition, the ones that we love, the ones that we love. You know, Kafka, maybe first and foremost among them. I think about a story we were talking about Jewish interpretations of Kafka. People always say, "Oh, Jew didn't appear, but once in his writing or something." But the Metamorphosis is a story about the transformation of a soul, and that's why it's called in Yiddish or Hebrew Gilgul, Der Gilgul, or Ha Gilgul. I mean, it really is about, I think, becoming a Jewish soul. And Kafka's father used to call his Jewish friends the same word that Kafka uses for the vermin that Gregor Samsa turns into. And it's a deeply spiritual story. And is it a religious story? Not at all. Is it, So I think for me, I never spent much time feeling I had to define those differences, but I have not ever felt myself to be a religious person, and I have never not felt myself to be a spiritual person.
It's really interesting. I'm going to break my own rules. I have one more question. I have the microphone, so you'll have to permit me. One of the, just to get back again to Kafka for a second, and is it a Jewish story? Is it not a Jewish story? I think for a lot of your books, people might struggle with the same question. Is this a Jewish book? How does this resonate with Jewish readers versus non-Jewish readers? I'm curious, as you've traveled and met your readers, how do you find different audiences read you? How does that change the way you read and write your own work?
I can say that I never occupy myself with the question of is this a Jewish story, neither with my own work or when I'm reading writers that I love or even don't love. I just feel, I think we're interested in the humanity of it, right? And the rest is like fabric, it's covering, it's texture, it's decoration. But I think, look, the books have been translated into so many languages, so what is a Chinese person's experience of the history of love, and like Leo Gursky, like God knows, like no understanding of his Yiddish words, and a few translations they wanted to have like a glossary. I remember in Greece they wanted to have a glossary because they thought people wouldn't understand the words, and I said like I don't think it's necessary. Like some things they won't understand, just like I don't understand some things if I read an Arabic book. But I get it. I still get enough of it. And what I need to know, I'll find out. I think it's just too disruptive. It reminds us that we're different rather than suggests that we have the possibility for like transcending those cultural or linguistic differences. So I don't know. I mean, having said all of that, I think that some of the strongest responses to my work have always come from Jewish readers, and oftentimes Israeli readers. I mean, Israel is like the only place in the world I'm recognized in the street as a writer. And I think there's like a passion to their claiming of their writers in a way that is not that is unfamiliar to me as an American writer.
And I think it's even reproduced a little bit in Farah Stark. There's one scene where the professor is just right in her face, or the family friend is right in her face wanting to talk about her books and how they fit in.
Yeah, there's a woman who stops her in the grocery store, and then she goes to Yad Vashem, and they stop her. Yeah, all from life.
So, all right. So, David, I think we're going to try to sort of tag team here a little bit. We've got a couple of microphones which can come around. We are recording, so please wait to be called on and until you have a microphone to ask. And I'm going to let David, I have a bright light in my face, so I'm going to let David look out and he will call on people. Okay. And our microphones are here.
So I'm going to direct traffic and also just remind everyone to please phrase your questions as questions and not as comments. So why don't we start right over there?
So I'm curious. You're such a beautiful writer. A question about the process and the after the process. So during the process, what do you dislike the most about writing? And since you've written such wonderful novels, as you look back at them, what do you love the most about what you've written? Not that this particular sentence or that sentence, but really, of course, you love to tell stories. What do you love the most about your work, and what do you find the most difficult about the process of creating that?
Wow. The second part of that is a really great question. Nobody's ever asked me that, and it's really hard. It's really hard to answer because I think we generally spend a lot of time like criticizing ourselves, right, for who we are and what we do and make, and et cetera. And we're not really encouraged to think about what we appreciate or love or cherish about what we might have done. So let me think about that a moment. But what, in terms of what I don't like about the process, I think it takes me a long time to really believe in whatever I'm writing. So for a long time, it really feels to me like words on a page. I was talking about that idea of like the mortal breath being blown into a character. But I myself don't believe what I'm writing, and I've come to understand that it's not through like lack of talent or even sometimes finding the right story. It's just that it takes time for like the magic to happen. Do you know what I mean? And it takes time for a story or character or a condition or situation to accumulate enough weight to really begin to care about it and for it to begin to have a direction that it insists on. And then you're caught in it as a writer. And not that there aren't still 1,000 decisions to be made and things to worry about. And it's not like it ever writes itself, not until the last word is done. But then it's sort of aloft in a way that I think becomes more exciting. Like once you have conviction in this as something. And until then, there's the question of like, why am I writing this? Why this and not something else? Why writing at all? You know. In terms of looking back, I think the things that I've written, it's always the things that I've written most recently that I can identify with the most. Like that, I wrote my first novel when I was 25, and I can't really remember what's in it. Like I don't even want to know what's in it. And I haven't reread any of my books since I wrote them, and so I think it's hard, like those feel like other lifetimes. They feel like they were written by another person, even though they're just, this is an extension of what I was then. And, but I think, I guess I feel, okay, let me think of it as, I feel proud that I struggled really hard to put into language things that were hard to say. That's enough.
Great, so why don't we?
Thank you so much for being here and sharing your thoughts. I'm curious to know the role that research plays in your work.
Until Farah Stark, almost none. I'm really not a great researcher. I used to be, I stayed in graduate school for a long time, so I guess I was an academic for a long time, and I used to turn in my papers, and my professors would always say, this is great, it's really well written, but we can't really decide what Rembrandt was thinking, we can't, you need to do research, and we'll never know what Rembrandt was thinking, And my instinct is to imagine, to make it up and imagine. So, research is not really my forte, but and I've often been lucky with it, just the thing that I really needed to solve a book would happen and fall in my lap. I remember that was the case in Great House, the desk, which moves and connects these four narratives, needed to get from Hungary to Europe, and I was like, well, I have no idea how that could have happened. And then I found this train that was called the Gold Train, I think, that when the Allies were entering into Hungary, the Nazis just put all of the loot, Jewish stuff that they had taken from apartments and jewelry, put on this train to try to get it, to Germany as fast as possible, and it was stopped midway, and all this stuff was then sold, and it was found in England and everywhere. So this desk suddenly had this good train that could move it where I needed it to go. So usually researches happen after the fact. But with Farah Stark, it was more again, it was a little bit retrospective. But I went to Israel when I was maybe a third of the way through the book, and I was trying to figure out what had happened to Epstein, because the book opens with his disappearance, but I had no idea, just like you have no idea in the beginning what happens to him. And I went out to the desert, and I was with this friend who was, driving me around and taking to me all these places in the Negev and the Judean. And then one night we checked into this Bedouin tent, one of those Bedouin tents not owned by Bedouins. And this guy, the owner, was this Jewish, I don't even know what he was, but he stayed up telling us about his 27 reincarnations. And by the time I got to sleep, it was really late, and my mind was really addled by this incredible story. And I took out my computer thinking I really have to figure out, this is great, these 27 incarnations, but what happened to Epstein, And I started to read through, and then I just suddenly had this, I was reading the Nicole part, and I just suddenly had this idea, wait a minute, yeah, Kafka didn't die in Prague, he came here, of course, he came here. And it was just that's it, that's gotta be it. And then I went back into New York and started to go back and reread all the letters and all the diaries and everything, and it just made such perfect sense. Like I said, I found all this so-called evidence for that, but that idea came because this guy was talking about his 27 reincarnations, and I was tired and in the middle of the desert in Israel, and so usually it's that way with me, but we'll see what happens next. Mm-hmm.
So the choice of the name Julius Epstein is an interesting one. Perhaps the greatest screenplay of the 20th century was written by Julius Epstein. Was that coincidence or?
Well, his name is Jules Epstein, but I didn't know that. What screenplay is that?
Casablanca.
Really? Wow, that's so great. This reminds me of when The History of Love came out. there's a character there called Alma Singer, and someone said, "Oh, like, did you know that was Isaac Bashevis Singer's wife? Of course, you must have known that." And I was like, "No, I didn't. I named her after, like, my first boyfriend when I was 14. His last name was Singer, and I was like, just she's 14, so I'll give her that name." So it was totally. But no, Jules Epstein. There was a reason I called him Jules Epstein, though. Was so Epstein in the book. This rabbi comes up to him. He's at this event at the Plaza Hotel, which is like welcoming Abbas, who's come to like address the UN Security Council, and these Jews have like been invited to this luncheon with him. And Epstein goes, and this rabbi accosts him and is like, Epstein, that's one of those names that goes all the way back to King David. And there are like these names that these families say, like Diane is one of them, or Abravanel, which those families say go back all the way, can be traced back to King David. So Epstein, weirdly, is one of those names. So I knew I needed Epstein, and then Jules, I don't know why, early on when I was writing, I had this vision, because I knew he was going to disappear in the desert, and I had this vision of people looking for him. And if they were looking for him, they'd be calling his name, and I thought about how, like, if they called his name and they said, like, Jules, 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 it would echo back, and it would be like, Jews, Jews, Jews. So that's how he became Jules Epstein.
Can you talk about the choice to call the character Nicole, like using your own name, and did you struggle with that, and like the trend of autofiction and like the line between fiction and nonfiction, like how you made that decision, and like what the impact of that was for you writing it?
Sure. It was not a hard decision. No decision is hard when you're writing. It's only hard when you get like badgered by journalists. But while you're writing, everything is possible and easy. And it seemed to me like what I was thinking a lot about at the time when I was writing this book was like I had been writing for like 20 years or something by then, and I felt like I knew something really well about what happens when you write. Like when you're in your writing room, you have this infinite possibility of who you can be, right? And you choose a character, and that character just widens your sense of being. And like this as a reader, right? When you read a character and you fall in love with that character, or you identify or empathize with that character, he or she just becomes another dimension of who you are. Like, just adds this pocket of being to you. And as readers and writers, we just grow dimensionally that way. And I think that's sort of like a secret that people never really talk about, how this flexibility of who we are and who we can be in literature. And then I thought about why that isn't the case when, like, outside of books, or for me, outside of the writing room, why the story of who I am just narrows down so immediately, right? So, like, I can make anything happen while I'm on the page, but then I leave and I have to pick up the kids and do the grocery shopping, and, like, everything, the story of my life, like, just goes back down to this familiar line. And I was just thinking about the origin of that narrative for all of us, which goes back to like the story that our parents start to tell us about who we are, and like, you're like this and your brother's like that, and that whole way that narrative of self develops. And then we just keep telling the same story like forever, and even when we don't fit that story anymore, we keep telling the same story, and even when it's too narrow and too confining, we keep telling it. And I really wanted to ask the question of in what ways can we alter the narrative, or widen, or even break the narrative, and what are the consequences of that, right? When you give up a form or story, you are formless for a little while, which is like terribly uncomfortable. So I really wanted, if I was gonna be inviting readers to ask that question of like, how flexible is that narrative of self? And why do we stick to that narrative so solidly? And should we? Then I should really use myself as a guinea pig. And so I thought, okay, let me name this character Nicole, and I'll give her like the bare facts of my own life. So she's a writer, and she lives in Brooklyn, and she has 2 children. But then I'm going to put her through all these fictional paces, and these things are going to happen to her that are so clearly not real, right? Like, unless you do believe Kafka didn't die in Prague. But really sensational things kind of happen to her, and we witness what happens to her sense of self or her story of who she is. So it was really for that reason it felt only like morally fair to do that and play that experiment out on a self without being coy about it.
So we have a question over there on the left side of the room. My left.
In History of Love, the very first page, you talk about Gorski from Slonim. Do you relate that to your real life? Is it your family history?
Slonim?
No, yes, Slonim and the name Gorski.
Slonim was where my grandmother was from, and it I'm constantly meeting people from Slonim since I wrote that book. Most recently, we have a really close friend whose cousin is here from Israel doing a master's, and she's using a room in my house, and her mother came to visit, and she's like, "We're from Slonim. What are the chances?" And so I think that it's funny how that book keeps bringing me back there. But Gursky was just a name that felt right. But I remember when I published an excerpt of the History of Love was published in the New Yorker before the book came out, and the New Yorker fact checks its fiction. And I remember they asked me like a million really difficult questions, and we got into arguments over like whether schmata should have an umlaut or not, or whether Metamucil makes a cookie or just a bar, and we just argued about everything. And then at one point, like we were both exhausted on the mat, and it was like the end. We'd gotten through everything, and then the researcher said to me, I had to check the names, and because I guess they have there's like liability if there's a name of somebody there, and I checked, and there was a Leo Gursky who lived in New York, and I was like, well, what happened to him? And he's like, he moved to New Jersey. There you go. I wrote your story.
Hi. So, first of all, I wanted to find out whether Metamucil is a cookie and a bar, or just
Yeah, I know.
or just
You
a
want
powder.
both,
Yeah.
right? I think that they argue that it only comes in a cookie, but I just remembered my mother gave us a bar. But I don't know. I don't want to make any bets here, having not done any research recently.
The question when Claire was asking you about authors in your books and how you mentioned that it's really an act of gratitude, that part of it is just the gratitude you have. And I wanted you to talk a little more about who are you grateful for as a writer, and how does that play out in your experience of writing?
I think there are writers that you really can move you at different times and really can change your direction, and then you pass out of them, and they it's over. You can never go back to them again. And there's some writers that become family to you, and even after their work is no longer as significant to you, they are family. That's it, And I can't explain to you exactly why that happens and for which writer, but I feel like they're writers who became family to me. Some of them who I never met, obviously. Sorry, I'm going to tell you the rest of this answer, but my son, I have a collection of books that I've had writers sign to my kids with the hope that we'll get them girls one day or something. And my son, when he was my son is now 13 and my other one's 10, but when the 13-year-old was 8 or 9 or something, he was going through the books, and he was like, how come I don't have one by Kafka? I was like, he was like dead before I was even born. He's like, why didn't Grandpa get one from Kafka? That would have gotten some girls, probably. Anyway, so I guess there are the writers who feel really like they really became familial. And those aren't always the writers who I feel necessarily as influenced by. So I think of Philip Roth that way, but that's because he really literally became familial to me. I mean, I knew him very well, and he was just such an important person in my life. And I was reading him since I was 12. My mom gave me a porn noise complaint when I was 12. I know what she was thinking. But like that's a lot of life to be accompanied by a writer, and of course Kafka and Bruno Schulz, and then like I think of other writers like David Grossman, the Israeli writer. I feel really close to his work. I think there's something about his sensibility that it's just so familiar to me. Something about what matters to him in life and being. And then, I don't know, there are writers who, like, for a long time meant a lot to me, like W.G. Sebald. I really, really love his work. But I don't feel like he's family somehow. I hope it doesn't only come down to being Jewish. I don't think it's only about being Jewish. But I think that there's something about, like, some roots or familiarity of language. I just started reading, or really seriously reading, a writer who never wrote that much but is absolutely incredible, called Leonard Michaels. Do you guys know his work? Leonard Michaels? Only one person knows Leonard Michaels? I feel like so many people need to read him because he was a contemporary, I guess he was contemporary of Roth and Bellow, maybe just a few years younger. And he died when he was 70, and he had, like, there's like a collection of it's the collected short stories that FSG publishes. And then there's a book called Sylvia, which is astonishing. But he didn't write that much, but he's like, he feels like family, even though I didn't read him growing up. He's just absolutely amazing. He wrote these stories toward the end of his life called the Nachman stories, which are all this character, Nachman, and they're just phenomenal. You should all go home and read him.
Do you think that acting and writing are similar? Secondly, would you like to see any of your books made into a movie?
Are acting and writing similar? Well, I guess that they both involve, like, a profound leap of empathy, of, like, becoming another person. Like, what is it like to be in this other person's body and mind and so fully occupy and think, like that person? So I think that they share that. I don't know if this is right, but I want to say that acting, I feel like actors would say this too, but it always involves some degree of, like, artifice, right? That you just can't get around. And I think really great literature can erase that artifice and become authentic. And you don't really know how to explain that to you any better than I think, because it happens in language, right? So, like, the world of language is not in a one-to-one relationship with reality. And so a character in language, like Leo Gursky, wouldn't work in life, but he works authentically in language. So something else is possible there that maybe isn't possible in this reality, in the flesh. And The History of Love was made into a film. It's not a film I would have made, but it was made into a film.
So our time is coming to an end. I hope you'll permit me to say that, Nicole, you mentioned, I think once or twice, the process of infusing life, breathing life into your characters. And as a reader of your work, I'm sure I speak for myself and for many people in this room, there's a sense of having had that animation, that spirituality breathed into us through absorbing your work through the written word. So thank you for that. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Please join me in thanking our panelists.